But on that note, let me say it's a pleasure to be here and to see all of you who are here now for this presentation. And let me start sharing my presentation. The case for democracy despite autocratization, and I'm going to base it on three things: our democracy report, recent, and that article in Democratization, actually another article as well, and also the case for democracy and the conference report, but also a series of publications around that we did last year. So let me start with a sort of democracy in the world. This is what we find. We are back to average levels of democracy in the world back to 1989. And now 70% of the world population live in autocracies. And the evidence for this looks like this, right? So here is the graph weighted for population, or the world average in the middle here, with a black line and the confidence intervals around it, and then the different regions. And it goes back 50 years. So you see the increases during the third wave of democratization, and then peaking in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then going downward quite significantly. And if you draw a line like this back in time, you end up around 1989. That is for the level of democracy enjoyed by the global average citizen, right? We mostly use this population weighted measure because democracy is ruled by the people. So it matters how many people are affected, right? It's very nice, and I applaud the democratic advancements in the Seychelles over the past 20 years, with a little bit of fits and starts, but anyway. And it's really nice, right? But it affects 90,000 people. The current wave of autocratization in India affects 1.4 billion people. We think that matters. And it matters for democracy in the world and what we mean with that, right? But I think this puts things in perspective. The entire sort of enormous expansion of political rights and liberties that came especially pronounced after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that spread throughout the former Soviet Union and then Africa and large parts of Asia as well, after Latin America and Southern Europe had sort of gotten a head start in the late 70s and through the 80s. All that expansion that happened after 89 at the global level has been eradicated. So what we also see now is that dictatorships are on the rise. They're sort of pure dictatorships, right? And we think that's one indication of this changing nature theme that we have in the report, that, oh, what happened? My presentation disappeared, but maybe it's just me. Things cropping up here. Sorry. Let me quit. Yeah, you see it's good. That wannabe dictators and dictators in the world are becoming more bold. So looking at this, then we take the same underlying data, but we use it to classify countries in terms of regime types, using the regime of the world classification. That is, I mean, based on obviously on what many others have done, going from Larry Diamond to Andreas Schedler and onwards, in terms of this with a closed autocracies versus electoral autocracies. And without going into details, we can discuss that later. Here's how the data shakes out, right? Last 50 years, again, you see this dark red line of closed dictatorships that were really in steep decline throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s into the 2000s, and then have been turning upwards again and going up quite distinctively here towards the end, and now count 30 in the world. And at the same time, the number of really good democracies, the liberal democracies, have been in steep decline from 42 to 34, and electoral autocracies, many countries that democratized during the third wave of democratization, really didn't become democracies, but became electoral autocracies. And then a number of countries have slid back into that, so on. And that's the most common regime type in the world. And if you put these two together, just over the last 10 years, then we've gone from less than half of the world population to 70% of the world population living in one or the other form of autocracy. This, we know, it's going to mean more wars, right? And this is almost like an iron law in international relations, conflict study, political science, building on, of course, Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory. That's been proven over and over again. Democracies do not fight wars with each other, and hence, the fewer democracies you have, the fewer countries in the world are there that will not fight wars with each other. And just as an illustration, Håvard Heger and his team calculated for us, based on their findings, that the risk of India engaging in an armed conflict with Pakistan has increased by 300% as a result of the decline under President Modi. And this is how Russia has moved on this probability curve based on 150 years of data, right? The probability of engaging in an armed conflict as you move along that electoral virtual constraints index, from more democracy, lower probability, and less democracy, higher probability. And by this sort of analysis, it's not a total surprise that Putin decided to invade Ukraine in beginning of this year. We have a policy brief on this, and that also refers to all the literature. It's available on our website if somebody wants to look at it closer. So that's sort of the first big picture on the state of democracy worldwide at the end of 2021 in perspective of the last 50 years. Let's look at the countries that are in change. The ones democratizing or autocratizing, I'm going to focus here on the latter. We see a record by end of 2021 of 33 countries autocratizing. And that's actually a record in pure numbers in our entire time series of the main V-Dem data set that goes back to 1900. So the last 121 years. And here we sort of look at autocratization as any move towards less democracy or more autocracy, if you like, regardless of the starting point. Right? So it's the sort of opposite to viewing democratization as any move towards more democracy. Using that metric, then here's the evidence for the last 50 years again, right? So you see the blue purple line here, and the democratization wave, and that's its height. We had 72 countries democratizing at the same time. That's the time when we were all happy. We were all looking forward to the future. Fukuyama called it the end of history, and so on. Right? And then that number has just dropped like a stone and down to 15 by our last count. Meanwhile, starting here in the late 1990, around 98, with Putin in Russia taking power, but it was also Venezuela and Chavez, of course. Number of countries autocratizing, starting to increase, and we see this, what we've labeled earlier as the third wave of autocratization taking shape and accelerating, especially in the last few years, and up to 33. So now we have over a third of the world population live in those 33 countries. And it's actually like 3.5% that live in those 15 countries that are democratizing. So they're tiny, small countries. This is really bad news also from this point of view. So in this other publication, also in democratization, we looked at all episodes of autocratization that start in democracies, and from 1900 to the present. And no matter how we slice this data, and this is just one example, almost 80% of them die. So just the statistical probability for the countries that are now in a period of autocratization that they will survive as democracies is very low, right? And just to look at the present wave, how it shakes out, and that it affects so many aspects of democracy. Here's a graph that compares, looks at different components of democracy. So the clean elections and freedom of association, rule of law, deliberation aspects, and so on. And compare in 2011 to 10 years before, how many countries were improving and how many countries were in decline. And all of them are above this diagonal, indicating that all these components were improving in more countries than they were declining. And we only count statistically significant differences, right? So clean elections, for example, here was improving in 29 countries and only decreasing in 6, right? And then compare now to the situation in 2021. Look at this. Boom.
Boom.
All the components are under the line in that red area. And worst of all, freedom of expression, right? And also deliberation. And that's where you have media freedom, as well as sort of individual freedom of expression. If we look at this at the indicator level, so drilling down to the actual indicators, we look at for the 33 countries that are autocratizing, these are the top 20 and above the red line, the top 10 indicators that are statistically declining in the most countries. Repression of civil society, respect for counter arguments, which is part of the deliberative, harassment of journalists, government censorship, and attacks on freedom of an academic culture expression are the top 5. Right? So it's sort of all the different aspects of freedom of expression and the actors that can exercise that effectively and sort of scream about what the regime is doing. And then civil society that can organize people into protests. Those are the things that are attacked the most and often the first by wannabe dictators. Who are these then? Well, let's look at the worst ones. Well, here is a map showing all the countries that are either democratizing or autocratizing and the level of it. And I show this picture also because you immediately get this sort of view of how, one, it affects the entire world, all regions of the world, and two, that a lot of big countries with large populations, but also huge international influence are involved here. India, of course, Turkey, Brazil, United States, Hungary, Poland, Philippines. So it's big, important countries that have a big impact on the world, also on other countries, right? I'll jump over this. It's the same information, but here are the top 10, the worst of the worst, right, in the last 10 years. And notice here that this 80% almost plays out in this as well in the contemporary period. They were all 10 were one or the other form of democracy before this. The squares are indicate electoral democracy and the cross-liberal democracy. 7 out of the 10 are now one or the other form of autocracy. Okay? So already also around these all that 80% almost plays out in 7 out of 10. If we look at the last 3 years, then there are a couple of newcomers on the top 10, among the top worst in the last 3 years: Slovenia, Tunisia, and Ivory Coast. Tunisia, perhaps in particularly saddening, with the only democracy that really came to be after the Arab Spring, and the one that survived, and then in 2020 really took a turn for the worse, and then 2021 even worse. And now this is also affecting EU. We now have 6 out of the 27 membership countries that are in an official period of autocratization. Everybody knows about Hungary and Poland. Hungary, we don't classify as a democracy anymore. It became an electoral autocracy in 2019. But now, in the last few years, as the previous graph also showed, Slovenia, quite radical change for the worse, and to a lesser degree, but still statistically significant, Croatia, Czech Republic, and Greece. And then it doesn't help to have the neighbors there on the eastern flank: Belarus, Serbia, and Turkey, of course. This is really worrying when you see this association that is actually supposed to be only democracies in this development. So that's sort of the second part with that I wanted to emphasize about the autocratizing countries. And then thirdly, there are other indications we think that sort of about this changing nature, or in terms of autocratizers becoming more bold. And one indication was the number of coups last year. We haven't really seen that continue this year, but it was notable that we had 6 coups, 5 military coups, and 1 the palace coup in Tunisia. It was a radical increase from the history since 2000. And then this wave of polarization that is reaching toxic levels in so many countries. It's no longer just the United States and some other countries. We record these toxic levels in 40 countries. And toxic meaning the point where you start to portray and talk about the opposition as enemies of the nation, as enemies to the country, as enemies to our way of life, and starting to see politics as more of a struggle of life and death. And enemies is a very dangerous way of portraying your political opponents, because what do you need to do with enemies? Well, first, maybe constrain their civil liberties and political rights, eventually get rid of them, right? Because they are enemies. That's a slippery slope. We know from history where it can lead to, and it's very dangerous. And here's how the data looks like. This indicator of political polarization, one of several that we have. They look all the same, more or less. If you're above the line, in the last 10 years, things have gotten worse, more polarization. If you're below the line, it's gotten better. If you're in the upper third there, then you have reached these toxic levels. Again, spread across the world, different kinds of countries. So it's really also sort of a broad global trend. And this has a close relationship to autocratization. So here's an example graph with 5 of the top 10 autocratizers, and 3 indicators for political polarization. And you can see that the pattern is very clear. First, the indicators of polarization go up, and then levels of democracy start to go down. And this, along with other data, suggests to us that it's not a coincidence political polarization is engineered and not engineered and encouraged by political leaders who want to autocratize, because they know they can use the polarization for their purposes. They can start to infringe on media freedom, on civil liberties, clamp down on journalists and civil society organizations, and so on. That's a pretext for autocratization. And this has very close relationship naturally with misinformation. And again, we see this increase going becoming worse and worse, or increasing more and more, I should say. Here's a graph just showing one of the indicators, government spread of misinformation at home, with the black line again in the middle being the world average, increasing quite radically over the past 20 years, and then the different regions, same thing, and worst of all, Middle East and North Africa. And if you then put together government spread of misinformation at home and abroad, it looks like this. So the countries, you can see the close fit, the countries that engage in misinformation at home also engage in spreading it abroad to other countries. And it's mostly autocracies that are doing this. They are on average much, much worse than democracies. So again, suggesting that this is a strategy both for the autocratizing countries, but also for autocracies to spread and let's say at least undermine democracy in other parts of the world. Worst of all tend to be China, countries like China, and of course towards Hong Kong and not the least Taiwan. But there are many, many others. It's not just one or two countries doing this. This is very, very broad, a broad trend as well. So that's the third part, sort of indicating how things are becoming sort of qualitatively different in some ways, and with emboldened autocrats in autocratizing countries, but also in the already autocratic countries. But let me move on from also the report and those two articles, and just for us here internally a little bit, with a sort of point out that there is this very close relationship between level of democracy and level of academic freedom. I think it's obvious just from this map that where academic freedom is guaranteed also tends to be democracies, especially liberal democracies. So we are also on the chopping block, of course, in all this. Now, despite autocratization and despite the lure of autocracy to some people around the world, then why should we have democracy? So we did a project that was supported by the European Commission over the past 2 years, seeking to collate the scientific evidence that's there about dividends of democracy, of having democracy, of sort of positive effects on other things of transitioning to democracy or of democratization. We call this the case for democracy. And the armed conflict is just one. I've already talked about this. Democracies don't fight wars with each other. Autocratization will lead to more armed conflicts in the world. And the latest, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is just one example. But it's also now clear with a number of very rigorous studies using synthetic controls and the like, and very long time series, and of course also the V-Dem data, very clear that democracies are better at economic growth. right? So here are two examples from this literature with the Acemoglu et al. Showing that democracies or countries that democratize on average have a 20 percentage point higher GDP per capita 25 years after democratization than they would have had if they did not democratize. And also the Knudsen study that also shows that one of the sort of reasons for this is that democracies, the red curve, not only have on average higher economic growth, but also that they avoid the really disastrous economic crises and negative growth at the higher end. That's the tail there to the left, right? And it's not only economic growth, but also in terms of how economic resources are used, right? So Moucher and his team has shown, among other things, that in terms of social protection schemes, going from an autocracy to a good democracy, on average, is associated with an increase in social protection spending that typically goes for the poor and marginalized, right? Increases by over 100%. And democracies in other ways, also when it comes to gender equality and social cohesion, produces better outcomes. Right? And even further than that, now with human health, very rigorous studies. The first one here by Bollicci et al. Is published in the Lancet, the #1 medical journal. And they have actually about 20 different outcomes that they look out, and life expectancy being one of them. And showing again with very advanced and rigorous analysis that democracies produce higher life expectancy, and transitioning to a democracy leads to higher life expectancy. But they also look at other things like curing cardiovascular diseases, fighting HIV/AIDS pandemic, and things like that. The democracies perform much better. And inspired by our work on the third wave of autocratization, they then, part of that team and part of another team, Wiggy et al., and that's in the British Medical Journal, looked at autocratizing countries and showed how also autocratization leads to all these worsening in health outcomes. And other studies, all again, sort of infant mortality, going from the bad autocracy to a good democracy, reduces infant mortality on average by 94%. That's pretty big, right? And even with climate change mitigation. So again, a series of studies that are showing on the advantages or dividends of democracy. The first one here compares democracies and autocracies on the Paris Accord and the climate change, commitments they have made on climate change mitigation. And the difference is quite big, a lowering of global climate change by 1.6 degrees. That's the difference. It's quite substantial. But also when it comes to implementation, like air quality and so on. And here in the graph from another publication with Bernauer and his team, CO2 emissions, the green line being sort of democracies, roughly speaking, and the blue line, autocracies. Autocracies continue to increase their CO2 emissions, and democracies reduce them radically. So in terms of fighting climate change, the difference between a world consisting of democracies and a world of autocracies is very big. All of this and some other areas as well that have to do with data and public goods and so on are in these policy briefs, collation of evidence that's out there, all available from our website. This is the website. you're welcome to visit it. I guess many of you have already and downloaded the data and use it, as Ursula talked about. We're very happy to see that this, what we spent so many years of our lives trying to produce, is actually valuable to researchers around the world. That's very gratifying. And on that note, let me say thank you for listening, and I look forward to an interesting conversation here.
Thank you very much, Staffan. That was an interesting talk, and we do appreciate your time. Now, I can't see a lot of the people, so I just have one or two questions myself, and then I will ask everyone to actually speak to you or ask their questions, because I can't see any hands lifted or anything like that. First of all, going all back again to the next stop Soviet, you said that you were challenging perestroika and glasnost. Did you not want these things to happen? What do you mean by that?
No, we were saying things like, okay, we are young people here in the Nordic countries, and including the Faroe Islands and Iceland, sort of the Nordic region, and we should have the right to meet our friends and do things, projects together with our friends in then Soviet Union. If you are serious about glasnost, then we should be able to come over without all this paperwork and invitations and everything, and meet our friends freely. And if you are serious about perestroika reform, then we should also be able and allowed to live at home with them, which in practice was forbidden or not possible. We should be able to do demonstrations also at military bases, and also at the Red Square and other places, and so on and so forth. And so we challenged the limits and the real content and meaning of it, and successfully on many of those issues. So yeah.
So, well, I'm glad to hear that. So you challenge it for that mustn't happen in that sense. And another question is, you sort of bunched Taiwan together with China when it comes to misinformation. Can you expand on that? Because I understand that there is a new legislation in Taiwan regarding this Information Act or something like that, but that Taiwan is recognized as a very well functioning democracy, generally speaking.
Yeah. No, so I didn't phrase it well, but what I meant to say is that China is one of the countries in the world that where the government is spreading the most disinformation abroad, and one of their main targets is Taiwan. So Taiwan is on the receiving end of much of that. And that when we first had that data, it was, and Taiwan, in our first round of data collection within this digital society project, which is like a sister project or a baby that was born out of V-Dem, but we collected data, and when we had it, it became big news in Taiwan, because then Taiwan was #1 in the world on the receiving end of misinformation from abroad, and of course that's China. So that's what I meant to say, that much of China's disinformation is directed at Taiwan, and previously also Hong Kong, but also other parts of the world, of course.
Thank you. No, that clarifies matters greatly. Please feel free to ask questions. As I said, I cannot see faces or hands up. So,
Ursula,
yes.
if you don't see me, can I say a few words?
Yes, please. That's what I'm talking about. Please speak whenever you want to.
So I think Staffan has shown once again the enormous richness of the V-Dem data, and now going back so many years and covering all countries in the world, and how many very interesting detailed information you can draw from this. And we have been using the data in our recent work and in our the most recent book, which came out yesterday.
Yesterday.
And we had specific cross-area comparisons of countries which were more successful in terms of at least maintaining their democratic level and contrasted with backsliders, like, for example, Estonia as a positive example and Poland as a negative one. And I can go region by region where we have done this, and we have drawn some overall conclusions from that more detailed case-based and cross-area analysis. But what I want to say, apart from your presentation today, which shows the richness, I think at least in the summary, executive summary of the report, and also in your introductory statement, I think your conclusions are a bit too sweeping and overly alarmist. And for example, if I quote, that the last 30 years of democratic advances are now eradicated. And I think this is going much too far, really. If you look at it region by region, if you take Eastern Europe, well, there are Orban and Kaczynski and others, but there are quite a few positive examples as well, and ups and downs in a number of the countries. And even Orban, Poland and Hungary are reined in to some extent by the EU and what they can do and what they cannot do. So it may create a wrong impression. And if you weight it by population, as you mentioned India, and of course also huge countries like Brazil, Nigeria, and others, if I checked the figures for India, for example, the 2014 level for India for your liberal democracy index was 0.54. For 2021, it was 0.36. For the electoral democracy index 2014, 0.67. 2021, 0.44. So clearly, these figures have been going down, but nevertheless, I would argue India still can be considered to be at least an electoral democracy. If you take the federal system, if you take the independence of the judiciary, the independence of the media, in spite of Modi's Hindu nationalism, there are strong opposition forces, there is a strong and vivid civil society. So this may create an impression to the overall public, which does not go so much into your detailed data, that this picture is, well, I would say alarmist, and maybe an alarm is maybe helpful, but I think it draws a too bleak a picture, and this may create well, more pessimism than is really justified.
Thank you, Dirk. Staffan?
Yes, thank you, Dirk. I'm glad that you enjoy the richness, and I'm also particularly gratified to hear that you use the sort of the V-Dem data also in a way to inform case selection of useful comparisons, which I think is one way that this type of quantitative data can also be very important and used for then facilitating qualitative in-depth research. That's an aspect that I think is sometimes underappreciated, and so I'm really gratified to hear that part as well. I think your questions or your comments and sort of pushing back here on being too sweeping and too alarmist, and perhaps particularly the alarmist. Now, the 30 years of advances that have been eradicated are based on the population-weighted measures, and by that measure, they are true. There's like on the global level, and that's the first graph I showed, that's just what has happened. Then you can debate whether you should use population-weighted measures or not. And of course, big countries like especially India, but also others, Brazil and so on. And on average, the autocratizing countries are big with big populations. And that would portray the wrong picture. But I think the misleading picture is really when you take and give equal weight to all countries. So that little dot in the ocean, seashells, or it's a couple of dots together, a set of islands with 90,000 people weigh as much as India. And we can go down the line. And that you know, the level of democracy in Seychelles would mean as much for the world as India. I think that's misleading. By those measures, not much has happened, and some have argued like that. Sven-Erik Skåning, who is also on the V-Dem project but has a different take on this, has published on this in Democratization. We provided an answer. It doesn't. I mean, so we have debated whether we should also provide measures that are weighted by, say, share of the world economy, share of world trade, share of their military capabilities. There could be different things. The picture would be probably relatively similar, right? In terms of how much this means for the world as a whole. And that's really what we're trying to portray and get a picture of. Obviously, and I think you're 100% right about that. That global picture does not give justice to, and in some ways disguises, regional and country deviance from that, right? So of course, Eastern Europe on average, and even a country like Hungary, has a better democracy score today than they had in 1989. Yeah. But there are other countries that are much worse off. So the global picture and the global averages and even the regional averages that I showed in that graph sort of disguise those things. And it's important to have those as well, I think. So I'm correct, and we do look at democratizing countries as well in the report. I didn't talk about them here, but I mean, we've debated this, but I don't think we are too alarmist. I think the world is changing fast, radically in the wrong direction, and I think politicians in the remaining democracies have been too slow to realize that. I think it took the war, when now Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for European politicians to really realize that this is getting bad. We might have to defend democracy with arms. And actually, Ukrainians are doing that. I think we have to. I think my reading of sort of the global development is really that the world is turning fast into a much worse state, and where a lot of countries become autocracies, and with that undermine and tends to drag other countries with them in a downward trend that we don't see an end to. And if it continues like this, there won't be that many democracies left in another 10 years, and then it's too late, right? I think when we see this in the data, and at least the way I interpret the data, and maybe your interpretation is different, but then I think we have an obligation to try and go out with that information and be alarmist, because by the time we can say, oh yeah, there are no democracies left, or there are only 10 left, then it's kind of too late. But we're heading towards that if it continues like that. I think I just want to comment quickly, sorry, Ursula, on India.
So you can have your view on whether India should be classified as electoral autocracy or not. We developed, long before India became an electoral autocracy by our measures, we developed a set of coding rules for operationalizing those established, or in large part of the literature, established categories, and find a way to use the V-Dem data to draw that line in the sand in a way between electoral autocracies and electoral democracies. And then those coding rules are applied equally to all countries across time and space. And by those, India crossed it between 2019 and 20, and have continued down. And I mean, at least by our measures and my information, I mean, no academics in India dare to have any official contacts with us today because of Modi. The press and the media are highly skewed and censored directly by the Modi government. Civil society has been oppressed increasingly over the past few years with Modi. Yeah, maybe my view on India is particularly, but it's just the coding rules, right? And it applies to, and then you could debate the coding rules and say that they are wrong, of course, and suggest others.
Thank you, Staffan. I personally think that being over alarmist is better than being over optimistic, because, no, seriously, because there is a warning in being, even if perhaps the alarmist side is a bit too overdone, nevertheless, we are being made aware of the changes that are happening in the world, but for everybody to see, even people who are not academics, who can observe the reality around them. So I believe that being too optimistic is being blinded to the dangers that do exist. We have, our latest book came out and it is on the optimistic side, and we should remain optimistic. Nevertheless, we have to be aware of what is going on, and your data is super solid to give us the proper impression of it. Nicola, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Ursula, and hi to everybody, and thank you very much for the presentation. If not a sobering one, but such important data for us to look at. I wondered if you had, I know it's a short period, but the time in terms of the response around the COVID pandemic, if you've had a little look into that, you know, so the last 2 to 3 years around what happened. Was there a spike in terms of decline of freedoms? I point to in particular the behavior of liberal democracies, which I personally found quite concerning in terms of Sweden being an outlier in this one, and actually taking quite an independent response to the pandemic, where many of the freer world tended to follow the lockdown procedures of China, which was for me quite interesting. And then I don't know if you've seen Laura Dodsworth's book, A State of Fear, where, you know, a liberal democracy like the UK using behavioral psychologists to weaponize fear in their population, but basically manipulate the population, these so-called nudge units. And then also a polarizing of society, which is coming through from the governments themselves. So I'm curious to, have you seen anything like this? Was there a spike in terms of the decline of liberal democracy within your classical or your consolidated liberal democracies? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we did a separate data collection. Anna Lurman took the lead there, and we hired a bunch of research assistants to track and code all the COVID-related measures that governments took around the world, and whether they were breaching international norms, what you're allowed to do in face of a pandemic. At the end of that first 1.5 years of the pandemic, and then our conclusion at the end of it was that I was worried, like you, about the liberal democracies doing these things, and I still worry about the demonstration effect and long term of that. But from the data the conclusion was not so worried, because most of the worst sort of transgressions that we saw were countries already autocratizing, using the pandemic as a pretext for further infringements, right, on journalist freedoms and media or civil society and movement and that sort of stuff, and hitting harder at minorities and so on. But not that it was sort of a driving force for autocratization. It had already started, and it was sort of strategically used by those countries. But demonstration effects in the long run, right? And all the things that like France did and so on. Yeah, I still worry about that too. Yeah.
Thank you, Staffan.
Thank you.
We have two more hands up. So let's start with Philip.
Yeah, thank you very much, Staffan.
We can't hear you.
How about now? Is that better?
But much better.
Yeah, we really enjoy the work that you're doing, and here in New Zealand, we also make use of the macro and the national level data that you produce. So thank you very much for that. I do have two questions. One question relates to the specific indexes that you rely on. Apart from the Liberal Democratic Index, of course, you have other indices such as the Egalitarian Democratic Index, which I think we underestimating the importance of that one. I'll come back to that point. But secondly, gender empowerment. And I think that is probably to latch onto what Dirk said, one of the more positive developments, sustained positive developments over the past 30, 40 years, as far as democratization is concerned, is the fact that women empowerment has taken major steps. Your data shows this, that it's a continuous process that we shouldn't underestimate. But just coming back to Egalitarian Democracy Index, I think one has to be aware that your data relates to the national level, and then from there you can aggregate to the global level. But one can't really draw much in terms of conclusions about what's happening on the micro level. And why are people, if it is a trend, why are people losing confidence in liberal democracy? It might have to do with the decline of egalitarian democratic practices. And I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are. Shouldn't we place more attention on these egalitarian dimensions of democracy rather than just on the liberal dimension?
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right about that. We've done some small things ourselves, but I encourage people to do more of that. That indicates, I did a quick analysis for Carnegie Europe, for example, on Europe and the changes on the egalitarian indicators, and how that was associated with autocratization. And there was a pretty clear, statistically significant difference, that reductions in egalitarianism when it comes to health, education, and so on, then were associated with later with autocratization. I myself, I think the enormous increase in relative inequality that we've seen been going on since the 1980s, also with the structural adjustment programs and everything that followed in the global South, I think that is part of the big story here. We don't have the hard evidence. We need to evaluate it properly. But my intuition sort of and what we have there, it's yes, it makes people insecure, makes them feel relative social status go down, and other things that lay the ground for, hey, this strong leader, I will come and save you, kind of thing. And then add financial crises to it. So yeah, I think you're right.
Thank you very much, Staffan. We are running out of time, but there's one more question coming from Pablo de Rezende. So let's go for it.
Okay, thank you, Ursula, Professor Ursula, thank you for this kind invitation. And I'm Pablo from Brazil, from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and we use a lot your data in our research group. It's great to hear from you. And as you know, we in this weekend we had this historical victory of Lula, and it was a great news for South America. So how can you like maybe to change this pessimist view, like the news from South America are great because Lula and Boric in Chile and Petro in Colombia are all governors from the democratic field.
Yeah, let's hope that Latin America takes the lead in the fourth wave of democratization. Let's hope that Brazil now will be one of the very few cases of sliding down and turning up again before democracy breaks down. That you will then join Ecuador, who did it, and South Korea, who did it. But there are very few cases of that in the last 20 years. But yeah, let's hope for it, and let's hope now that the protests with the truckers and disappear, and that the federal traffic police actually follow the law and the constitution.
Thank you, Staffan and Pablo. It's congratulations, and we are very excited that things are changing for the better, hopefully, and in the long run. And once again, Staffan, my thanks to you for a very interesting and educational talk, and for all of you people, kind people and nice people, to join us, listen, ask questions. And now we're going to go and think about all of these things.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.